matter of the indictments of the defendant Alec Murdaugh for the murders of his wife Maggie and his son Paul, the state of South Carolina rests.
There you have it. The state of South Carolina has rested its case in chief in the trial of Alec Murdaugh, and the defense is underway. I'm Angenette Levy, and thanks for joining us here for the lunch show on Law and Crime. It's President's Day, so court is dark, but we are not. We are here with you, and we are taking your questions for the entire hour. So submit those to us on Twitter, Facebook, and in our YouTube chat. We will get to as many of them as we can, and we've got a ton coming in already. So thanks for being with us on this holiday where court is dark. With me today, is Michael Bryant. He is a host here on Law and Crime and also an attorney, and Gigi McKelvey of Law and Crime and also the host of the Pretty Lies and Alibis podcast. We are taking your questions the entire hour. But first, let's look at what the defense presented on Friday as it began its case. I think that they were caught a little bit off guard. They had probably hoped to start their case on Tuesday after the long holiday weekend, but Judge Newman told Dick Harpootlian, you should be ready to call some witnesses. So they called a former PIO with the Colleton County Sheriff's Office to testify, and also the coroner of Colleton County. He was called to testify about what he saw and what he did when he arrived on the scene that night. Now, keep in mind, the coroner there in Colleton County has been the coroner for 30 years. He's not a pathologist. He's not a doctor. So he is not a medical professional per se. This is an elected official. This position is elected, so anybody can run, and if they get elected, they can do the job. Take a listen to what Coroner Harvey told the jury.
And so you perform a function also. I've looked at the death certificates of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh, and you have a time of death of 9 o'clock. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let's go through when you begin to examine the body to determine a time of death. Tell me how you do that.
Well, initially that evening, when I initially got there, I was told that SLED was coming, which I knew, depending on where SLED was coming from. It depends. It could be an hour. It could be 2 hours. It all depends on what part of the state and what group is actually coming to you. My initial processing was that I went and checked both bodies, and I simply put my hands in their armpits to determine how warm they are. This is one of the things we do sometimes to try and estimate a time of death. Is the body cold? Is the body warm? And one of the other things we check for is what they call rigor. And rigor is basically when a person dies, the body goes through this process, and as it goes through this process, your joints start to stiffen up. And when I initially got there, that was all I did initially because I knew SLED was coming.
So is it rigor or rigor? I'm not sure how you pronounce it.
I call it rigor.
I call it rigor, but so if you allow me to say rigor.
That's fine.
I've never said rigor. Was there rigor or rigor?
There was not.
Okay, so these folks had been dead less than a couple hours?
1 to 3 hours typically is what they say that rigor should start developing.
Okay.
So there you have it. Coroner Harvey talking about how he determined the cause, or the time of death, in part by putting his hands in the underarms, the armpit area of Paul and Maggie, to determine possibly when they died, and he's calling rigor mortis rigor. That's what he calls it. Again, not a medical doctor, but he has been the coroner there in Colleton County for 30 years. Did not perform the autopsies, so let's just be clear on that. Pathologists perform autopsies. So let's talk about this. There's a lot to discuss with the coroner's testimony. Eric Bland is with us now. He is the attorney, or one of the attorneys, for Gloria Satterfield's estate and her children. Michael Bryant is here with us, and Gigi McKelvey. So guys, what do you make of this? I'll start with you, Michael Bryant. We have the coroner talking about how he determined the time of death that went on the death certificate, an official document, and this is how he did it.
Yeah, he kind of looks like a doctor, but I'm not a meteorologist, but I can tell you where the wind's blowing, left, right, up or down. I think it's useless information. It's amusing. I just think without having the expertise and credentials, this guy said more than once, I knew SLED was coming, basically saying I didn't have to do anything too crazy because the actual professionals were on the way. I just think it's interesting, but I think most interesting is the fact that we did not hear from the prosecution a time of death. Why not? They had the ME on the stand, and not once was that person asked the estimated time of death. So now you have this guy coming on for the defense without really the credentials to establish time of death, but he does. So I think it's a big issue in this case because it so affects the timeline.
It does. And the only time of death we've really heard in this case, Eric Bland, has been from the cell phone data. Dr. Reimer was not asked about the time of death. The coroner obviously used an estimate. He said it could have been 8, it could have been 10. We know it wasn't 8 o'clock, but he said it could have been 8 p.m., it could have been 10 p.m. He split the difference, 9 p.m., based on the underarm temperature. So obviously, I think the defense is calling the coroner to show, look, we don't know what time these people died.
Well, I've actually heard from the Lexington County coroner here in our Midlands area in the mid part of the state. And that person said the testimony from the Colleton assistant coroner was just laughable. No one does rectal temperatures ever anymore. It's such an antiquated way. And testing under the armpit is almost a little bit like voodoo medicine. I think it's clear that the time of death was post 8:44, the Snapchat video, and definitely before 9 o'clock. I think the cell phone data is the most persuasive of when the time of death was. In fact, this case, the electronic evidence, whether it's the OnStar evidence or the phone moving or the phone's ceasing activity, is the most powerful part of this case. Not blood, not GSR, and certainly not DNA. And I think the testimony actually hurt the defense case and really showed that they are having difficulty coming up with something that's credible. Certainly Jim Griffin, in the motion for a directed verdict, slipped in, well, Alex must have forgotten that he was at the kennels. Now, I'm going to tell you something. You don't forget that. If it's the last time you've ever saw your wife and son again, no parent would ever forget where they were. And he forgot it for 3 months, don't forget. From June all the way through August. He forgot it when he talked to Ronnie Crosby. He forgot it when he talked to the police officers. And he forgot it when he spoke to his friend Chris Wilson about it. So it's a real problem. The defense seems to be searching with a lantern at this point to find a defense.
So I think that the cell phone data, the 849, is compelling, supporting evidence, but we don't determine time of death by touching armpits. Okay, so I just think it's weird. Gigi, you've covered a lot of trials, you've watched a lot of trials over the years. This is not how we do time of death. I think the cell phone stuff is good supporting data, but we need a medical professional to say, this is my estimate. Obviously, Harvey says his estimate is 9 p.m., but it just seems kind of silly to me.
Yeah, we all were a little bit speechless in the courtroom when that testimony came in. Just didn't really know what to say. I've never heard of using the armpit method to try to estimate a body temperature or time of death. So I agree. I think the cell phone data is sort of that's all we have. Like you said, the medical examiner has not given a time of death, the coroner's was so broad, we know they were alive for almost 50 minutes after he said they could have been dead at the earliest. So yeah, it was just one of those moments in the courtroom where we all just sort of looked around at each other.
Yeah, it was a little bizarre. And nobody's going to do a rectal temperature. I always thought they did the thermometer in the liver. I thought that was the best way to do it. But, It'll be up to the jury to decide what weight to give that. Let's get to your questions now. The first one comes from Cindy Schillings from Facebook. When Alec was being interviewed in the car, the first thing he said about his son was he was very intuitive, like a little detective. And I'm thinking Paul busted his dad for something he wasn't supposed to find out about, possibly an affair. Anyways, it's an odd first sentiment about your son. Eric, I found this to be really, really interesting because the minute he said that in the police interview, and then we heard the testimony from Marion Proctor last week, who was Maggie's sister and Paul's aunt, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, the little detective. What did the little detective find out?
Well, the little detective found pills in his computer case and said, in a sense, mom found them, and he notified the father that, look, this is a problem, and this began in May. And it probably was a situation where there was some marital discord that was developing both from this pill discovery and also Maggie complaining that she didn't have enough money, and then the fact that she wouldn't sign over the beach house. Again, it's a confluence of events that literally engulfed him. That's the prosecution's theory. Again, you and I have discussed this many times, that it may not be a perfect motive for normal, rational people, but for a monster or an irrational person like Alex, it made perfect sense. And just to give you something, I talked to a criminal lawyer in Charleston who told me that according to the National Drug Intelligence Center, oxycodone in Charleston, South Carolina has a street value of $10 to $15 per pill. At $50,000 a week and $15 per pill, that's 3,333 pills per week he would be taking, or 476 pills per day. To take 476 pills per day would probably take an hour to sit and consume it. So I just don't think the drug aspect of it is a big issue. It's big enough that it caused some probably family discord, but it still doesn't give an explanation, and it doesn't pass the smell test that he was spending $50,000 a week on drugs, like Dick Harpootlian said.
Well, and I think a lot of people forget that Alec Murdaugh, along with cousin Eddie, is facing a narcotics conspiracy charge related to oxycodone. So something more was going on there. Something more was going on, and then guy doesn't have any money. He's not a very good businessman, and I talk about that from just the drug dealing perspective of this. Who knows what was going on here? So let's get to our next question. Mike Masacciato from Facebook. Why weren't Paul and Maggie's hands, Michael Bryant, checked for GSR? We always got any gunshot case with bagged hands that were taped shut at the wrist to preserve any evidence. She said she's an OR nurse here. Why was Alex allowed to leave the hospital? A tox screen would have shown drugs in his system. So Mike is asking Michael, why were the hands of Paul and Maggie not tested for GSR?
Yeah, now you're starting to make some of the defense arguments. Look at how many things that have been pointed out on cross by the defense that were not done by SCLED, as I call them. Areas that weren't searched, things that weren't done by the book. The question becomes, was it intentional? Were they given kind of the benefit of the doubt to this powerful or once powerful family? Or are they just not good at their jobs? There are a lot of things that should have been done that weren't done. Would they have found anything that mattered in this case? Doesn't matter from the defense perspective, because all they're doing is trashing the process. And you do that enough, you get one or two jurors to think, these guys, how do we believe anything they did? Because they were so negligent in the stuff they didn't do, no matter what the result might have been.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
Yeah, I agree with you, Michael. I think it's the deference that was shown to Alex after the murders and the 911 call. I don't believe any judge would have granted a search warrant to go to Almeida to search the former solicitor Randolph Murdaugh's house based on just the fact that Maggie and Paul were murdered at Michel. I think that the defense has kind of vacillated, because in the beginning of the case, they said they did nothing but target Alex. They eliminated any other suspect right off the bat. Well, then last week, Jim Griffin made hay about the fact of what they didn't do. You didn't search Almeida. You didn't do the drain. I think it's exactly what you just said, Michael. There was real deference being shown to the Murdaugh family because of who they were and who their father and grandfather were.
Now, I want to respond to that because they had a search warrant. Katie McAllister had a search warrant for Michel. She decided not to execute it. Plus, the family, was giving consent. So why didn't they just ask, can we go over to Almeida? They didn't do that. They could have asked. They didn't have to get a warrant because they were asking to do all kinds of stuff. So that's kind of where my mind goes with all of that. Let's get to one more question. This one is from Past Day from Twitter. I am honestly interested in knowing why Paul went to the cabin that night. Was anyone else there at the time? Gigi, what is the bottom line on why Paul went there?
We really don't know. And I'm not sure if it actually shows him inside the cabin or the area. I'm not sure of the spread or the bubble around that area. But as far as we know, it was just him and Alec until Maggie came home later on. So it seemed like either he went by himself or potentially Alec went with him.
All right. We are going to continue to take your questions. Keep those coming to us, but we're going to take a quick commercial break. Stay with us. I'm Angenette Levy, and you are watching Law and Crime. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Welcome back. I'm Angenette Levy, and you are watching our lunch show Q&A here on Law and Crime. Court is dark today because it's President's Day. It's a federal holiday. A lot of people have been asking why that's so. So I just answered that question for you. The defense will really start its case in earnest tomorrow. They called a couple of witnesses on Friday afternoon, but tomorrow they will get really into the meat and the potatoes of their defense. So we are taking your questions this hour, as we always do. So keep those coming to us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And we have a great panel here to answer your questions. Adventure Boy from YouTube asks, question, and Eric, I'm going to throw this one to you because you may know the answer. Has the forensic financial investigation wrapped up? Have they figured out where all the money is? I think there is so much more to the drug trafficking than we've just heard, just a feeling.
The answer is no. I have some contacts that I've had in the FBI, and they are looking in earnest to figure out where the money went to. And what role may somebody other than Cousin Eddie have played in it, whether it's the Cowboys or somebody else. The answer is that the feds are going to be a backstop to any of these state charges if somehow he miraculously pulls a camel through the eye of a needle. The feds can get him for bank fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and failure to pay income tax. So the financial investigation is far from over because it goes broader than just the law firm, Alex and Cousin Eddie and Palmetto State Bank.
So let's get to our next question. That's actually really interesting because of the feds being a backstop for this. Dawn Exclusive from Twitter asks, how do y'all feel about the prosecution's case now? In the beginning, y'all seemed weary. Seems they saved the smoking gun for the end. I'll start with you on that one, Michael. And this is something I want to address because people are always like, oh, you guys seemed this, you seemed that. The prosecution's the one with the burden here. They're the ones that has to, have this case presented in a, beyond a reasonable doubt. So I don't think anybody's weary of the case or, but they're the ones that have to have all the ducks in the row. So Michael, how do you feel about the prosecution's case?
Yeah, I've said this before, and this is not a hot take. I mean, we've seen many cases. I've either tried them, observed them, reported on them, hosted on them. This is the weakest circumstantial case I've seen presented. Having said that, the last day for the prosecution was their best. But now let me shoot that down a little bit. They had the agent who really acted as a compiler. I've got the OnStar GM information. I've got the cell phone information. And I put this timeline together. I've said from day one they should have had a big old board in that courtroom. And as each witness provided timeline info, they could have posted it on that board so the jury's getting a picture blossoming in front of them. They tried to do that with this guy, but he wasn't very good. And in the end, he had to admit he had no personal knowledge of any of the information to which he was testifying for that timeline. So nice effort, and I know what they were trying to do, but it really kind of fell flat if that was going to be the big crescendo for the prosecution's case. I do think it's a little better case, but still the worst circumstantial case I've seen presented.
Well, and they didn't get that data, the OnStar GM data, until last weekend, the weekend before last. So, which is really weird. Part of me is like, when GM came back from the search warrant and said, yeah, we don't have that, I would have been like, could you look again? Because, typically that type, OnStar that's all it is GPS. So let's get to our next question. BX Addict from YouTube. What do you think Cousin Eddie was also privy to? Was there yet another murder somewhere or something else? Gigi, what are your thoughts on that with Cousin Eddie?
Look, they were really into some rough stuff with this drug dealing, and clearly they were doing more than bags of pills is not just an addiction, is trafficking. So there's no telling with these two. It looks pretty deep on the drug aspect. So nothing would surprise me at this point when it comes to Alec Murdaugh at all. Nothing. But I don't think Cousin Eddie's just this henchman that runs around and kills his wife and son and all that. I don't know. I'm from the South. I know people like Cousin Eddie. He probably just felt good hanging out with somebody like Alec.
Well, and Alec was his attorney. Alec said he represented him years ago at one point in time. That sounds like that's how they met. So,
right.
But
Lots
it's
of
a big leap
coming his
from
way.
Yeah, and it's a big leap from, the town drug dealer or what have you to murderer. So, I mean, I think that's just because you're dealing drugs doesn't mean you're a murderer. So I just want to throw that out there. And his attorney, Amy Zimmercheck, has told us, Gigi, she was on the lunch show with us one day, that he has an alibi. He was not involved in this. And even Alec Murdaugh, during the roadside shooting interview with his lawyers and SLED on the phone, when they asked him if Cousin Eddie was involved in Moselle, he said no, which I thought was astounding. How do you know that? Miriam from YouTube, question, why can't they determine the time of death by autopsy? Eric, what are your thoughts on that? Because by the time that the bodies would have arrived for autopsy with Dr. Reimer, rigor mortis would have maybe have no longer been present. Bodies go into rigor, they come out of it. So is there a reason, do you think, that the doctor didn't determine the time of death or wasn't asked about it?
I don't know. It was an hour, it looks like a solid hour and 15 minutes before first responders came, and first would be the police, so he wouldn't know it unless a coroner came and really has an understanding of how your body goes into rigor mortis and where it starts and how fast it progresses. A lot of it also depends on the temperature of the outside air, where the person is, what was in her stomach. I'm just not technically and scientifically and medically proficient enough to speak to that. But again, I am persuaded by the satellite evidence and the cell phone evidence. And again, this is not a science so much as it is an art. There's a little bit of both. And so you can narrow it down to a time, but I don't think you're ever going to get there to the minute or the second. But I think they've done a pretty good job. I tend to disagree with Michael. I don't think it's one of the weakest circumstantial evidence cases I've ever seen. I would agree that from a scientific and blood standpoint, it's weak as to putting it on Alex. But his own lives and what he did at the kennel and then coming back home and what he did in the house, the laying out of Maggie's underwear and pajama pants, and it's just all too strange. And the fact that he never said, let's gather up my son Buster and my family because I think that they're in danger because someone's trying to kill this family. And just the extent that he went through on the roadside shooting in making the state go through and hiring a sketch artist when he knew it was Cousin Eddie. And when you look at that photo of the sketch, it almost looks like Anthony Cook, like he was going to start to blame Anthony Cook, which fits into his constant saying, I know this has to do with the boating accident.
And just for our viewers who may not know who Anthony Cook is the boyfriend of Mallory Beach. He was literally holding on to her in the bottom of the boat when the boat crashed back in 2019, and she flew out of his arms, he says, out of the boat. I mean, that's who Anthony Cook is. And the sketch does look similar to Anthony Cook. Let's get to our next question. Jeremy C. from YouTube asks, does the panel really buy the defense's claim that Alex was Googling a restaurant, among other things, in the wake of their deaths, as him being in shock? Michael, what do you make of this? I'm a little bit skeptical of this. I feel like we don't have enough information to know if he was actually doing this Googling or if maybe his Safari was open. People kind of texted me and tweeted me about this over the weekend and on Friday about, was it this, was it that? I just don't know. So what is your thought on this? Do you believe he's Googling the restaurant and doing all of these things as he's standing there with Paul and Maggie dead and waiting for authorities to arrive?
Yeah, I agree with you that we don't know enough. I don't think it's corroborated, but let's assume that it is. So now you're with that argument from the defense perspective that, hey, nobody knows how they're going to react when something as tragic as this unfolds. But I think it smells horrible. If somebody thinks he really did that, first thought is he's so detached because he did the murders. So for him, it's, what am I going to have for my next meal? So it depends on how you perceive that information. I think the strictest sense should be, let's take it with a grain of salt. We're not sure that really did happen. And if it did, it just smells bad for the defendant.
But Michael, we know he looked at a bikini. It
looks awful if he did that.
But we know he looked at the photo. We know he looked at the photo from Michael Gunn of the girl in the bikini. And we know he texted CB Rowe about coming tomorrow and working on the sunflower plants. And I'm just saying, look, we're all parents here. At least I am, and I know Angenette is. If, God forbid, we drove up and our spouse and our child was brutally murdered, we would be clutching them so tight and screaming that it would take the jaws of life to get us detached from them. We wouldn't be walking around looking at our phone, doing bikini photos, and talking to a farmhand. I'm just sorry. I get it that people experience shock in different ways, but I've never known a loved one not to be grabbing and screaming at the top of their lungs when they find their loved one dead.
Yeah, I mean, the text to CB Rowe, we know that happened. I'm just saying, like, if you open a text, say your texts are open, if something's open, you could possibly mark it read without actually reading it. I don't know. I mean, the only person who can answer that question is Alec Murdaugh. Let's get to our next question. Question from Shemp Howard from YouTube. How does Alex explain pulling around the back of the Almeida house when he arrives? He pulls up to a workshop instead of a main driveway. Odd. Hiding things? Question mark. Gigi, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I was surprised the prosecution didn't really dive into that a bit more. And I just think that it kind of fits with that whole night that, you know, is this something typical that he does, or is this just that night? You got all these deleted calls. There's so many things I feel like that we could have clarified. And that's one of them. But yeah, I was surprised they didn't go in for the throat on that and say, oh, well, you're going to your mom's after dark. Why are you going to the wood line? Yeah, I thought that was kind of a missed opportunity to throw a little thing, because you got the timer we had set for 20 seconds. Well, if you've got a 2 or 3 minutes, set it for that and see, is that enough time to go to the wood line and get rid of guns or whatever? So I thought that was a huge missed opportunity.
And Agent Owens said something about Miss Libby having a work shed or something like that. So I wonder if there is a shed back there. And when we come back, I'm going to give you like a little bit of a teaser because we have to take a quick break. I've heard about somebody who may be testifying about what goes on and what happens when you drive to Almeida. So when we come back from the break, I'll tell you a little bit about that. Keep the questions coming to us, and we'll answer as many of them as we can. I'm Angenette Levy, and you're watching Law and Crime. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Angenette Levy, and thanks for being with us as we take your questions on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. A lot of great questions coming in. I did a little bit of a teaser before that last break and told you about what we might be hearing about in court coming up. There's an attorney, Sarah Azari, who Eric goes on national TV and argues with about this case like all the time. And I was talking to her on Twitter over the weekend, and she claims that Buster Murdaugh may be taking the stand to talk about, you know, what the family does when they arrive at Almeida. Where did they go? Where do they go in? What goes on? So she claims that Buster may answer a lot of these questions. The defense isn't commenting on what they're doing or who they're calling. We know that they're going to be calling some experts. So I want to know, Eric Bland, since you spar with Sarah all the time, she tells me Buster's going to be testifying. What do you think of that?
I don't think he will, but you know, she may have a better pipeline in the defense. Certainly, my discussions with Dick Harpootlian have really slowed to a crawl since all this began. He and I used to be pretty close, but I don't think it's relevant. I think the timeline on the OnStar is relevant, and you know what Alex did and what Buster does when he goes to Almeida is two different things. We do know that he went behind the house. We do know that Michel Smith was correct that he was only there for 19 minutes and 34 seconds. She said 20. We do know that Alex, according to her, tried to get her to say that he was there 30 to 40 minutes. And we do know that he slowed down as he was leaving the property, which looks like he either placed a phone call or a text to Maggie. And the question is, was Maggie's phone already in the woods? Because according to the OnStar, he slowed down to 40 miles an hour from, I think, 58 or 64. Where the exact spot of her phone. So I'm not sure what Buster can offer. He wasn't there the night of the murders. He can't offer anything about that. He could talk, I guess, about his own personal habits or when he was with his father. But the fact that he's going to say that's the way we came in, I mean, that's not going to help Alex ultimately. What's going to help Alex is if they can prove that there was a second shooter or that he didn't do it. But you know, right now, all the evidence is pointing him. All the direction points to him. He didn't nail Cousin Eddie. He told them on the roadside shooting that Eddie had nothing to do with Michel. So it wasn't the Cowboys because they asked about the Cowboys and drug gangs, and he said no. He didn't say we're being targeted or anything. He kept on saying
I do think it's
people
weird.
Involved in the boat. It's the boat. It's the boat people. The boat accident.
I do think it's weird that he said that he said, no, it wasn't the Cowboys, it wasn't Cousin Eddie, they weren't involved in Moselle. Like, I thought that was really bizarre. Like, how do you know? Let's get to our next question. Michael Bryant, Linda T. from YouTube asks, if Maggie was exploring getting a divorce, can't the prosecution seek information about that? I had people asking me about that on Twitter as well over the weekend. Would that still be privileged? Say she did meet with a divorce attorney. We've heard no testimony at all that indicates that she was thinking about that. Her sister said that, you know, things weren't perfect or whatever, but that she was happy.
Yeah, there was that story before the trial began that roughly 6 weeks before the murders, she had consulted with an attorney. Obviously, you're not going to be able to learn the contents or context of that consultation. But the fact that she just went to see an attorney for that purpose, that would be discoverable. But we never heard anything about it. So either it didn't happen or there was nobody that they could get to corroborate that it did happen. So I think that's, you know, it just fell flat. It's something. Just like when we learned that she found out about the pills and started investigating what those were by searching the colors and the names on the pills, that's something. But the discord in the relationship, it never really panned out.
Here's another question, Gigi, for you that I think is really interesting because it goes to what Michael Gunn said on the stand. Rachel Hamilton from YouTube asks, why was Michael Gunn sending a group text to Alec on the night of the murders? Gunn claimed they were not friends. Did he actually know more about the financial crimes than he is claiming? I was kind of wondering that too, because if you're not really close with Alec, why are you sending him a group text with an attractive woman's photograph in it?
Yeah, that seems to be what all of us were kind of asking that day that came in about the text. And I've seen a picture of it. Yeah, I mean, maybe he does. And I don't think we've seen the half of people who are going to be implicated along with Alec for financial crime. So maybe that's something that comes in down the road. But yeah, I mean, you could chalk it up to just a bunch of dudes texting a bikini picture back and forth. But I mean, come on.
Yeah, I think it's weird. And I think a lot of people, once everything started coming out about it, they're like, oh, yeah, I wasn't really friends with him. You know, we may have had some business calls, but we weren't pals. Like, text messages might tell a different story. Catherine Hunter from YouTube asked, do you think the shotgun double load, the double aught load, I mean, that was first shot at Paul knocked down Alex, which caused him to be shooting the birdshot round from the ground? Why was it from such a low angle? Eric, I know that you're not a ballistics or, crime scene expert, but a lot of people have that question because it does appear that second shot to poor Paul's head, because this is horrific, it seems like you'd have to be down low. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Only that that is a plausible explanation, that there was some kind of physical altercation there. If you listen to the Snapchat video, he says something like, "Oh, Dad," and there may have been, some kind of pushing, or, when you go to grab a gun and you shoot it the first time, you may slip. It's not an easy thing to shoot a gun, especially if you're doing it in haste. And he very easily could have taken a knee or slipped, or Paul grabbed the barrel, and that's what caused him to be on the ground to shoot upwards. But I don't think Dick's going to be able to convince the jury that it was a 4'10" person who shot him, as opposed to somebody who's 6'4". Again, that's just spitballing, and spitballing isn't reasonable doubt.
Angenette, along those lines too, I had somebody in law enforcement explain to me that after that first shot to the chest that Paul took, it could have knocked him back a bit. And we know that Mr. Kinsey, or Dr. Kinsey rather, when he was testifying, had Paul going down at an angle. Alex, he's a hunter. He could have shot from the hip. Paul is not standing up straight. He could have shot from the hip. It doesn't mean he had to be on the ground. So I think too, you've got that aspect of he's getting knocked back. He's favoring one side. And come on, Alex probably been shooting a shotgun since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. So I don't think it's unreasonable. He just fired from the hip. Maybe at an upward angle, but he didn't have to be laying down, I don't think.
Yeah, somebody joked with me the other night that, maybe it was Tattoo from Fantasy Island. I don't think that was the case, but we just don't know what happened. There's so much we don't know. It does seem like an odd angle, and you don't know what's going on if somebody shoots somebody with a shotgun. And poor Paul, they said that was not going to, he could have survived that chest shot, okay? And so he's probably saying things, and they said he took a couple of steps toward the feed room door. We don't know what went on, but all I know is that it was horrific, whatever it was. Catherine Small from YouTube asks, this is a good question, Michael Bryant. Why would Cousin Eddie agree to commit a murder when he could get into so much trouble if he actually killed Alec? There are so many questions about this. Alec Murdaugh's like, yeah, I asked him to shoot me and he said, okay, do it. So what on earth? Why would Cousin Eddie agree to do that?
Yeah, you got to get in Cousin Eddie's head there, which is probably not a good place to be. And he was going to do it for free. It's like, sure, I'll kill you, no big deal. It makes you wonder what the relationship really was between Alec Murdaugh and Cousin Eddie, whether it was related to drugs and the sale of them or just the acquisition of them. There's something more going on here, unless Cousin Eddie is just that stupid that to have his relationship with Alec Murdaugh, he'll do whatever that guy asks him to do. I guess that's possible. I just think there's so much more we don't know about that relationship.
I think you're right about that. And a lot we don't know about what went on the side of the road that day, because it really doesn't make sense. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get to more of your questions. I'm Angenette Levy. You're watching Law and Crime. Welcome back. We are taking your questions here during the lunch hour in the trial of Alec Murdaugh. Court, of course, is dark today because it's President's Day. It's a federal holiday, so everybody's getting a break. But we are still talking about this case because you want to know about it, and we're here to answer your questions. Gigi, let's throw this first question to you. Raven Question asks, and it's specifically for Gigi, could you tell something from the faces of the jury, i.e. guilty or not? That's kind of like, that's a loaded question, but how do you feel about what the jury, is there anything you can glean from their facial expressions?
Nothing that would point me to which way they're leaning. They're very attentive, and I think that they're taking their job seriously. So like any good jurors, I think that they're staying stoic until they go back for deliberations. But as of right now, I really do think that that last witness putting that timeline together, though, that was one of the most focused that I've seen that jury since day one. They really ate that up, and I think it was good to kind of just put everything in a line. And so, but otherwise, no, I've seen them laugh along with the prosecution. I've seen them laugh along with the defense. I've seen them shake their head kind of in disgust with, both sides at times. So yeah, it seems like they're just taking it all in right now, which is a good thing. They're doing their jobs very, very diligently.
This is a good question for you, Eric, since you practice law there and you always have your ear to the ground. Robin Ray from YouTube asked, does anyone know why after law enforcement investigated Michel, they decided to reopen the Stephen Smith case?
Maybe just to put more pressure on Alex, if they feel like that there is something that he knows or something in his family. Almost the same way that they've announced that they've opened an investigation into the death of Gloria Satterfield. They haven't done anything towards it, but it's just, I think pressure breaks pipes, and it's just another external pressure that they wanted to put on him. The only connection that's been made is that Sandy Smith, Stephen's mother, said that Randolph, for some reason, showed up on the accident scene. He wasn't asked to come. And he called her allegedly and offered her that he would represent her. And she said, well, what do I need representation for? So I think it's just external pressure, whether there's a real investigation going on. We haven't heard anything, but, and I provide legal assistance to Sandy Smith upon request. So it's just external pressure.
And I do want to let people know, I reached out to SLED recently. The investigation's still ongoing. The Attorney General claims they don't have anything to do with this right now. At least that's what they told me a few weeks back. So it isn't at the prosecutorial stage. It's still in the investigation phase. Yodwinder, Grewal from YouTube. Michael, we'll have to make this one quick because we're running out of time. Why would the killer only take one cell phone and leave one behind? We literally have 30 seconds.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
We just don't know. In the haste of that kind of craziness, who knows why somebody does or doesn't do something.
Great answer.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, we've had a lot of fun answering your questions this hour, and unfortunately, we're just about out of time. We want you to stay with us, though, because we will be continuing to cover this trial. Testimony resumes at 9:30 Tuesday morning, with the defense likely calling some experts. So we hear they're going to have a lot of experts. So stay with us. After this break that we take, we want to thank Gigi, Michael, and Eric. But after this break, Michael Bryant will be here to take you through the rest of the afternoon. I'm Angenette Levy, and thanks so much for being with us. You are watching Law and Crime. We'll be right back.